If you're still using ISO 100 in your photography, you might be doing yourself a disservice and not actually getting the higher quality that you might be thinking that you're getting, and it could be making your life a lot harder for the photography that you're doing. I'm going to cover that in this episode. I'm going to concentrate on real estate photography, on some of the best settings to use for interior and exterior photography when it comes to ISO, but this also will apply to a lot of other genres as well. To set the stage for this, let's first take a look at a quick experiment. Here we've got two photos taken of my tiny little backyard, and we can see the difference. On the left over here, this was shot at ISO 100. Over here on the right, then what we have is something that was shot at 2500 ISO. Now, if we were to take the shutter speed and change that, then we can also change the ISO as well. So in the first shot over here at ISO 100, it was at 1/250th of a second at f8. And then over here on the right, we're at that ISO 2500, and it was 1/8000th of a second. Now this is 5 stops difference, and technically being, it wouldn't necessarily be ISO 2500, it would be ISO 3200. So to be able to have ISO 3200, 1/8000th of a second would be then the equivalent over here of ISO 100, 250th of a second. But notice a big difference here between the two if we use the exact same equivalent ISO. This is something that's often overlooked, and that's that ISO does vary because it is something that is not really a standard any longer, and it's really just a gain. It's basically a volume knob that's on your camera to turn up the signal that's going through your sensor. So there's really nothing that they have to calibrate and be exactly on compared to, for instance, the aperture would be a more accurate value. But still, we can see here that by the histograms on each of these up here at the top, that the one on the right is running a little bit hotter. So what we'll do is we'll just go back down here to ISO 2500, and this will still serve very well. Here we're at just about the exact same exposure, but you will notice there are some differences in the histogram no matter what. But if we zoom in and take a look at the difference here, then I can see over here on the left at ISO 100, when looking at that mountain peak over in the very distance, well, there's really not that much difference compared to over here on the right. If we get up into the sky where we should see noise, we're really not seeing any noise. Even if we go and bring up the equivalent of the exact 5-stop difference, when we get up here to the sky, there's really no difference in grain. Yes, there's a difference in exposure because of how the ISO value is treated by the camera, but we're not seeing really any noise. If we take a look though at some of the leaves on the tree, that's where we can see things that are a little bit more telling. So if we go, for instance, back to this ISO 2500 shot where the exposure is a lot more similar, then we can see here that it's a little bit sharper over here at ISO 100 than 2500, but the fear that we all have is that we're going to get grain, but that's usually not the case. So to be expected, the image quality is being affected by the high ISO because of the amount of gain that's being applied to the sensor, basically turning up the volume knob. If you were to do that on your stereo and amplifier, then you would get some type of distortion. But how much distortion is really what's key. And it used to be in the film days, sure, there was an ISO value that really mattered on the quality of the film that you were going to be using. And when it came into DSLRs, originally, yes, those sensors were very sensitive to the amount of noise. But mirrorless cameras nowadays are pretty well immune to that, where they really are well shielded and they do know how to handle a higher signal that is passing through not just the sensor, but also the rest of the electronics in the camera. So we're not seeing grain really introduced that much. In fact, most cameras you really won't see grain until you get past about 10,000 ISO. You can experiment with this with your camera as well, doing the exact same thing that I did here by increasing your ISO value and increasing then your shutter speed in accordance with that so you get an equivalent type of exposure as you would on a lower ISO. And that way you can see where your camera would fall within what ISO range is safe to use. But for the most part, when we're talking about getting into the thousands ISO value compared to the hundreds have no difference. If you shoot at ISO 100, you shoot at ISO 200, it really isn't going to make that much of a difference to your image quality. So starting out with something very simple, if we were to do some standard exterior photography, a lot of times I use ISO 200. And why? Because if you were to hand hold something and you're using ISO 100 f8, you'd be on a sunny day at about 250th of a second. Well, just by doubling the ISO to just ISO 200, immediately I can shoot twice as fast. Instead of using 1/250th of a second for my shutter speed, I can use 1/500th of a second. That ensures that if I do anything handheld, I don't have to worry about motion blur. Now, a lot of times I'm using a tripod for all of my work anyways, and it probably doesn't matter, but you'll get used to using, after a while, you do photography full time, you just want your settings to be there and you just shoot and go no matter what it is that you're doing. So whether I'm doing handheld outside or I'm on a tripod outside, I like to keep the settings the same, especially since there's really no difference in ISO. But let's talk about when you're outside and you're doing something like for a twilight shoot, and you're doing something at night. That can vary quite a bit because we don't want to have too slow of a shutter speed in all circumstances. Now, it is nice to have some nice motion blur of water where we might want to use a low ISO value so we can hold the shutter open longer. But a lot of times, shooting houses at night, shooting pools overlooking those, you're going to get movement in tree branches from the slightest of breezes. So if you're using ISO 100, your shutter could be open so long that all the trees look blurry. So it's very common to use on twilight photography anywhere from ISO 200 to ISO 800. And you really aren't going to, once again, like we just showed in the experiment, see much in the way of noise if, that is, you expose properly. So now let's get into something a little trickier, and that's when we're talking about interior real estate photography. Now, this can get really tricky because we need to light it up. Now, if you're going to do professional photography, not HDR, that means you're going to be incorporating some level of flash so that you get correct colors, you can get views to the outside, you can get sharp, crisp images that are color correct. And this is something, by the way, if you're not familiar with that, I do have courses and books that cover all kinds of real estate photography. I've got a course on doing professional interior photography, a course on doing expert editing for interiors, also a course on exterior photography, and one on doing videography for real estate. I've also written best-selling books on real estate photography, and I have links to all that down in the description for this video. And one of the things that I stress in a lot of my books and also in my Pro Interiors course is that you have to balance aperture, shutter, and ISO based off of how much flash power you're going to be using and how you're going to be overriding then the amount of ambient light and the artifacts, the color and things that can come with it. So for instance, on an interior shot, to be able to get enough flash out of it, I have to be able to keep my aperture at a reasonably wide aperture. So a lot of times that could be anywhere from f6.3 to f8, depending on what I'm doing. In some cases, it would be about f9, never f11, because what you're going to do is inhibit the amount of flash power. If you use the proper amount of flash power with the proper aperture, then you can get very good depth of field, sharp, color correct images without having to then stress your flashes. If you have to use a smaller aperture, you're going to stress your flashes a lot more, you're going to cause a lot more color casts, you're going to make life a lot harder than it has to be. So inside, not the window views necessarily, but lighting the inside, that can be anywhere from ISO 200 to ISO 400, sometimes a little higher in difficult situations, sometimes a little bit lower in places that are extremely bright. But that sweet spot in there, that's where you aren't going to be stressing your flash if you use the proper aperture. Now when it comes to the window views themselves, sometimes I am down to ISO 100. And why? Because I have to be cognizant of the sync speed. I'm limited, and you'll be limited on your camera, as to how fast your shutter speed can go when you're using flash. So when you're doing darken mode window pulls, to be able to bring that view from the outside in, it is done with flash, so we have a sync speed we have to be cognizant of. That means that we do have to lower our ISO in that situation. It's not because we're worried about getting grain, it's about the fact that we're going to be using flash. Video is another one that really scares people that are used to shooting at low ISOs. It used to be, once again, ISO 100 was where you want everything to be, but when you're shooting video, a lot of times you'll be inside at about ISO 2000, sometimes ISO 2500. This is something I cover in my videography course, but basically you don't really have to worry about it, especially with today's modern cameras. You really aren't going to see noise, you're not going to see grain. The one thing you will see at those high ISO values is sometimes a neutrality in your colors. So one of the things we saw on the experiment that we did when we were outside, things weren't just quite as sharp. The color, you could see it in the histogram, was just a little bit different. And what happens is you are losing a little bit of dynamic range, a little bit of color sensitivity. But what happens when you're inside, the colors are going to be neutral most of the time anyways when you're doing real estate videos. When you're outside, absolutely use ISO 100 so that when doing video, you can use the 180-degree shutter rule. But the bottom line is, don't let ISO dictate how you're going to shoot the rest of your settings. Once you have that stuff figured out between your aperture and your shutter speed, then consider ISO. That's the next value. It's so insignificant in most cases that a lot of cameras today are actually referred to being as ISO invariant, meaning that the ISO value really has no effect at no matter what settings you use. And to a large degree that is true, but it will depend on your camera. I do suggest that you take an experiment like I showed here near the beginning of this episode and do this with your camera, see how well it does show up as far as grain and other types of dynamic range changes or color sensitivity, and then you'll become more comfortable at using the higher ISO values when you need to.